The Kokoda Campaign, an overview. The Kokoda Campaign was a battle fought from July to November 1942. The battle was fought along the Kokoda Track or Trail in Papua New Guinea, shown on the map by a red dotted line. The Kokoda Track ran through 160 kilometres of mountainous, dense jungle and muddy terrain across the Owen Stanley Range in Papua New Guinea. It was the only pathway that provided direct access to Port Moresby. There were three distinct participants in the Kokoda Campaign: the Australians, the Papua New Guineans, and the Japanese. Since the early part of the 20th century, Papua New Guinea was administered by Australia and was an Australian territory. On the 21st of July 1942, Japanese forces landed on the north coast of Papua New Guinea with the intent of capturing the township of Port Moresby by crossing the Owen Stanley Range using the Kokoda Track. Papua New Guinea was strategically important to both the Japanese and the Allies. Taking Papua New Guinea would allow Japan greater scope to defend the territories it had recently conquered in the region: Malaya, Borneo, and Indonesia. If the Japanese seized Port Moresby, they would have an ability to launch, or at least threaten, a southward invasion of Australia. There were two main stages of fighting during the Kokoda Campaign. The first was the great push south by the Japanese from the 29th of July until the 17th of September 1942. The Japanese repeatedly defeated the Australians along the track and forced them to retreat. The Japanese continued to gain territory and moved south towards Port Moresby. Once Port Moresby fell, Australia would be in their sights. The second stage of fighting was the reoccupation of territory along the Kokoda Track by Australian troops between the 28th of September and the 2nd of November 1942. Essentially then, there were two clear stages: the first, when the Japanese dominated, and the second, when Australia regained territory. On the 29th of June 1942, the Australians were given instructions to secure Kokoda and its strategically important airstrip. Maroubra Force set off for Kokoda on the 7th of July 1942, and they reached Kokoda on the 15th of July 1942, ready to stop the Japanese advance. Meanwhile, Japanese forces landed and captured Guinea on the 21st of July 1942, and they started advancing towards Kokoda on the 23rd of July 1942. The stage was set for a confrontation between the Japanese and the Australians. The first notable battle took place at Kokoda on the 29th of July 1942, and it ended with the Australians retreating to Deneki and then on further to Isarava. The Battle of Isarava was a key battle of the Kokoda Campaign. The Australians were outnumbered. There were 3 to 4 Japanese for every 1 Australian, and they suffered defeat, continuing their retreat. The battle for Brigade Hill, also known as Butcher's Hill, was Australia's most humiliating defeat and Japan's most decisive victory of the campaign. Despite these losses, Australian troops resisted the Japanese advance, fighting in appalling conditions and slowing down the Japanese advance. The strategy of the Australians was to withdraw while putting up as much resistance to the Japanese as possible. Australians were to fight every inch of the way. The Japanese had their goal of Port Moresby in sight, but the Australian resistance prevented them from going any further. Japanese troops were starving, and by late September, only 1,500 combat troops from a force of 6,000 remained. Half had withdrawn sick or wounded, many were missing, and there were more than 1,000 dead, and food supplies were dwindling. By contrast, the Allies were strengthening their position. Australian reinforcements were arriving in Port Moresby, and for the first time, Australians outnumbered the Japanese. The Japanese could actually see the lights of Port Moresby from their position at Iorabiwa Ridge, but they were in serious trouble. By late September 1942, no supplies were getting through to the Japanese troops at Iorabiwa. Each man's rations were only 150 grams of rice a day, so effectively the Japanese army was starving to death. On the 25th of September 1942, Japanese command announced the decision made by the Emperor to withdraw. This takes us to the second stage of the Kokoda Campaign. By 19th of September, heavy artillery was launched by the Allied forces up to Imata Ridge's summit, and by late September, no supplies were getting through to Japanese troops. The Japanese, following the Japanese Emperor's instructions, withdrew on the 25th of September. The final phase of the Kokoda Campaign lasted from the 28th of September, when Ioraboa Ridge was reoccupied by the Australians, until the 1st of November 1942, when they recaptured Kokoda.